Hey, well, this morning we had a wonderful time together as church at St. Michael's High School here in Crosby, but unfortunately the sound broke when it came to my talk, and it's just one of those really annoying things because it felt really important, the talk this morning. So I don't want to let it go. I want to give it another round. So for those of you who were out helping with the kids or at home and didn't hear it, you get a chance to hear it because feel like this is an important one. So what it is Psalm 124, and we're going through what's called the Songs of Ascent. There are a selection of 15 psalms in the middle of the song book called Psalms, which is in the middle of the Bible. And these 15 songs were sung by pilgrims as they went from their homes up towards Jerusalem. And as they went towards this place of worship, it kind of reflected their own spiritual journey towards God. And so each of these songs speak to a different part of that experience of our life as it moves towards God. And so today is Psalm 124, and before we jump into what it's saying to us today, let me read it for you now. So if the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive. When the anger flared against us, the flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away. Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So when I was kind of sharing about our previous Psalm 122 last week, there was a moment which just felt like a bit of a God prompt and kind of resonated with a lot of people in the room. And it's that, through our devices, especially through contemporary media, we just get every day bombarded with a stream of negative news, which over time gets us to expect the very worst and kind of resets our perception of the world as a dangerous and flawed and ultimately doomed place. But that is not the story that God tells us through the Bible, that actually ultimately we are saved and that this world is going towards a much better place than it has ever been before. And this psalm just speaks so beautifully to these two things. I mean, at first, it actually agrees with what the doom scroll tells us, that this world is indeed a dangerous place. All the way through verses 2 to 6. It talks about disaster and predators tearing us apart and floods knocking people over. And what this is all in reference to is a group of people who have their anger pointed towards the psalmist. I don't know if you've ever had someone angry at you. It doesn't feel particularly safe. And in fact, what our bodies pick up on is the imminent danger that this person poses to us, and sees them less as a human being and more, like this psalm says, like a tiger or a tsunami, something that's going to flood through and destroy us. And the imagery it's picking up on is something that happens occasionally in the Middle East where this was written, where it can get very dry and you can get very hard, dry ground, but up in the mountains you can get rain. And normally that rain will then gradually flow down through rivers and water the plains. But every now and again, there will be so much rain up in the mountains that it comes down as like a wall of water, just destroying everything in its path. Houses, crops, you name it, all absolutely ruined. It kind of brings to mind those really sad images that happened in Tonga just a few weeks ago of people's lives being literally washed away. And it's saying basically that this disaster that's besetting them is this fury of people. And when people are angry at you and all logic goes out of the window, it is a destructive force, and it can destroy lives, careers, mental health. It can undo people completely. But what I'd like us to do this morning is to consider beyond even the personal things. Just consider anything that has been through your life, or maybe is going through your life, that is wreaking destruction like a tsunami or like a wild animal. That could be an addiction that you have. It could be a relationship breakdown, an illness, a redundancy, a depression, another mental health condition, a diagnosis, a sudden turn in the economy, or your own personal bankruptcy. Or it might be personal. It might be somebody else. It could be your nemesis at work, or your whole workplace is toxic and corrupt. It could be a family feud that's breaking apart the wider family or your immediate family. It could be a former friend of yours who has now turned on you and is now like that tiger about to rip you to shreds. And what the Bible agrees upon, that the world agrees upon in the doom scroll, is that, life is dangerous and it is full of hazards. We're following along with this, Eugene Peterson's brilliant book on the songs of Ascent called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And when he's talking about this Psalm 124, he opens with a quote from Paul Shearer, which says, "God is almost intolerably careless about crosses and swords, arenas and scaffolds, about all the evils and the plagues. His caring doesn't mean that he goes in for upholstering." And I love that. God loves us, but it doesn't mean that life is going to be warm and squishy and cushy like a nice sofa. It's going to be full of dangers. If I was going to put it simply myself, it would be, who told you that this was going to be easy? Because sometimes Christians are shocked when hard and difficult and unpleasant things happen to them, as if you have the life of faith, those things shouldn't happen. And if that's happening to you or someone else, then clearly there's something wrong with their faith, because this shouldn't happen to someone who believes in God, who trusts in God, who lives a good life, right? That's not how it works. Well, actually, Jesus never promised anything like that. Actually, he promised the opposite. Regularly, he said, for those who followed him, they would be rejected by their own family and friends, that because they were, all the initial followers of Jesus were Jewish, that they were likely to be thrown out of their synagogues, their religious communities. They would lose livelihoods as a result of this, and some of them would indeed go on to lose their lives, which is exactly what happened. And it's exactly what Jesus himself went through, where he was rejected from his hometown. They tried to kill him. Later on in Jerusalem, he would be killed, and along the way he was regularly rejected, persecuted and hated for representing what he was. And so it would be for all of his followers. Jesus said, if the world loved you, that meant you belonged to the world. If you belong to me, the world is going to hate you. And so if you follow Jesus, you are not promised upholstery. You are not promised a cushy, nice night in with a nice temperature and the perfect food, or any of that. The best options that the world gives us for dealing with all of this is technique and management. Any kind of way to avoid suffering, avoid the pain, make your life easier through technique. What this psalm offers is not that. What this psalm offers is God. The opening of the psalm says God is with us. Rather, it phrases it, if God was not with us. It poses the question, can you imagine a life if God hadn't turned up for us? I like the way that, again, Eugene Peterson puts it in A Long Obedience. Says the psalmist is not a person talking about the good life, how God has kept him out of all difficulty. This person has gone through the worst, the dragon's mouth, the flood's torrent, and finds himself intact. He was not abandoned, but helped. The final strength is not in the dragon or in the flood, but in God who didn't go off and leave us. See, ultimately, this psalm is not about how hard life is, but about how God saves us through these dangers, through the hazards of life. That God is ultimately a God of deliverance, of escape through and not out of our circumstances, which is kind of brilliant, Because I love that God, as our Father, is not a kind of helicopter parent, health and safety kind of a parent, you know? He's not the parent that's always hovering around, making sure the kids reaching their maximum potential, but not exposed to anything too dangerous. He's more the parent who's like, go off and play in the woods, have yourself an injury, come back in an adventure, and you will learn something. He's not the helicopter parent, but rather, he makes no lies about the fact that this life will be hard. But underneath it all is this story that life is about salvation, about help, about being saved, that this world is going in a good direction and not a bad one, rather than the constant narrative of doom. And this escape from almost impending doom comes really unexpectedly. See, we all get ourselves eventually into a situation where we're like, there is no way out of this. I have no ability or strength to deal with this. This is an impossible situation. This is the end of me. This is the end, at least, of, X, Y, Z, or at best this part of my life, and nothing is going to be the same after this. And then God, the variable in this equation. Lizzie, my wife, always jokes that one day she's going to write a book called Butts of the Bible. Apart from the unfortunate name, it's actually a great idea, because there are a lot of important buts in the Bible. When that word but appears, it means that God is about to hinge things in a completely unexpected direction. And this is what God does regularly. Whereas the world looks inevitable and doomed, God steps in and does something fresh and new and unexpected. And here's the thing, is that this psalm, this song of ascent, is not arguing that this is what happens. It's testifying to it. It's a song, it's a story that this is what has happened in their own lives. The Bible itself attributes this song to David, King David, who was that boy who faced down a giant. We think that's kind of like a metaphorical thing or a mythical thing of a great big giant thing, but that Goliath was just an enormous man and an incredible warrior, and David was just a teenager, and he should never have won, but he won. He knew he could win because God had saved him from danger before. As a young boy, he was looking after the sheep, one of the youngest of the family, and again, if you want to talk about different ways of parenting, go back a few thousand years where you just have a bunch of kids and you have one of them look after the sheep, be exposed to wild animals, because if you lost one, well, there's always more. And David was like, just one more, he had to, as a young boy, fend off wild animals, and he knew that God saved from that experience so he could step up to Goliath. But that was not the end of his needing to be saved. He knew that one day he'd become king, but the current king, Saul, also hated him and tried to kill him repeated times, but he would not lay a hand on God's chosen king. And so he lived under, intense danger, could be attacked by the current king at any moment, and was regularly. He lived his life under threat. At one point, his grandson tried to overthrow his throne. David, for most of the years of his life, lived in danger, but could sing this song, that when danger came, God saved. When the floods came through, when the dangerous animal attacked, that at the end of it, somehow he was still left standing there, not destroyed. Now, if you're cynical, you're not going to like this. This is just going to sound like good PR for God. There's not even arguments in this. There's no good reasoning. And, I love apologetics. I think it's really good. But any good apologist, anyone who tries to defend the existence and the goodness of God, will say at some point, they just can't go all the way. There are limits to it. You can't argue the defense of God. At some point, even though there's lots of good stuff in it, it kind of runs out. And so then you step into the world of testimony, of saying, well, I might not be able to argue this, but look, I'm still standing. But you know what? This isn't just good PR. In fact, the Bible, and especially the Gospels, would be terrible PR. And, you know, quite a lot of people have pointed this out, that if you were going to create a religion and a mythology around this person called Jesus, you wouldn't write it the way it's been written. You wouldn't have, you know, the first leaders of the church reflected in as bad a light as they are. And in a world where women weren't allowed to testify in court because their testimony was not seen as valid, you would not have the very first witnesses to Jesus coming back from the dead to be women. You would only do all of these things if that's how it happened. And this is how it's happened. In the messiness of life, in the dangers of life, God's people sing this song and tell their story time and time again that God saved them. If it were not for God, they would not be standing here today. And so this song encourages us to sing it. Sing it with me. Come on, sing it with me, Israel. It's kind of a playful start to the song itself, where it starts the first line and it's like, wait, stop, no one's joining in with me. Come on, everyone, sing it. If God had not been on our side. And all of us who have followed Jesus could sing this song. And I was wondering as I put this talk together, you know, if I was to write this song, if I started my song, if it hadn't been for Jesus, what would I put? And I started to write my list that, well, you know what? First of all, if it had not been for Jesus, I would most likely be in a marriage that wouldn't have let me do all the adventurous things I have done. You know, my faith was not always deep. It was not always, you know, hot. It was, you know, shallow and a bit cool. But someone at my church invited me to spend 2 weeks in Chester telling tourists about Jesus, and quite unexpectedly, out of my mouth came the answer, yes. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure I would have agreed to that, but apparently I just haven't, so I did it. And when I started telling people about Jesus from all around the world, it suddenly all clicked together. It all made sense. This faith I'd been brought up to understand suddenly came alive in a way it hadn't before. And foolishly and wonderfully, in a prayer room during that mission, got on my knees and I said, Jesus, I want you to take my life. And he did. From that moment on, my personality changed. The trajectory of my whole life changed. I was headed for safety, but God had other plans. I was headed to be a computer programmer. It's something I decided I was going to do from the age of 11, which is really dull and sad, but it's true. I had my plan of how things were going to go, but God had another plan for me. And that plan involved, like King David, all kinds of dangers. You know, again, without Jesus, I'm sure some of the things we've done would have left us dead, broke, and emotionally ruined. Definitely bitter, angry, and resentful without his healing presence and spirit working in our lives. I think there's every chance we could have been divorced. Sadly, it's getting to that age where it's starting to happen around us. And, you know, like Lizzie and I have been through 6 miscarriages, multiple seasons of severe ill health. We've moved house so many times. We've had job losses, business loss, things that have ended other marriages. And yet somehow we have a great marriage today. Without Jesus, I don't think we would have that, or maybe not even each other right now. I think at this point, we might be even homeless, because having our funding unexpectedly pulled a couple of years ago, we didn't know what we were going to do. And yet here we are in our own house, able to pay the bills, able to pay the mortgage right now through a just total miracle of Jesus and his church pulling around us, which is its own miracle. And as I started to write this list, I realized this could be a long song. If it were not for Jesus, the number of disasters that would have overtaken mine and our lives. In verse 7, this psalm talks about an animal, a bird that is trapped in a snare. An animal that had no way out, could not rescue itself, and was now just waiting to be gathered, killed, and eaten. Consumed, life over, done with, and there is zero way out. And yet, somehow, from somewhere, the snare breaks and the animal is free. Yesterday, we went to this most incredible day conference. It's called Rhythm of Hope. It's unique. It's for people who are struggling with childlessness and fertility issues, coming together from all over the UK to worship God together, to listen to some speakers, to consider some ethical issues, to take some time out to kind of look at how they are going to survive this whole thing. And what was amazing was testimony after testimony of people who had either not been able to have their own child or did have their own child, and who had come to the conclusion that child or no child, it was not going to give them the healing that they needed, or the salvation, the saving that they wanted. It's particularly powerful from those who've struggled for years through brutal treatment in order to have a child, finally get the child and go, you know what, the child is wonderful, but it's not the answer. And 2 people on the day said the only child that was ever going to give them all the salvation and meaning and purpose in their life that they needed was born on Christmas Day. It became all about Jesus. The other thing that we were reminded of is something that happened to ourselves, in that in this infertility journey, it's really easy to lose yourself in the pursuit of having a child. You throw everything into it and you pause everything else. It's like your life stops. It's a common experience. It's a snare. The child becomes everything, and so you end up losing yourself. It's a snare. Something that you have wandered into and become trapped and stuck. But miraculously, somehow, this thing that absolutely destroys individuals and couples, God gave a way out to all of these people, one after the other. They were liberated. But having kind of led a church for a little bit now, I wonderfully have seen people liberated from snares, you know, from addictions, from abusive relationships, you name it, liberated from these things. But sadly, I've also seen people liberated from this snare step straight back into another one. There's a video that's going around on Instagram of a shepherd pulling a sheep out of a ditch next to a road, and this ditch is long and thin, runs next to the road, but he's rescued the sheep, pulled it out of the ditch, and the sheep goes bouncing down the road, like kind of like happily, and then it jumps in the air and then it lands perfectly back in the ditch again, even worse, wedged in than it was before, in more danger, more of a snare than it was. And sadly, that is quite often the human condition, that God rescues us from the snare and then we just go back straight into another snare. But for those who take God's invitation to be liberated from the snare, make their life all about Jesus, the opposite can happen. And that actually through the flood, through the danger, a purpose emerges that would never have emerged otherwise. There's a wonderful couple who've been to Rhythm Hope a few times and have kindly shared their story. And they're originally from Australia, and they went through the journey that a lot of people have: multiple IVF, failed adoption, all of this kind of thing, until the point where they kind of had to give up. And as a couple, they decided to move to the UK just to do something, anything new, to pursue a different dream that wasn't just having kids. And when they got here, Meredith took up this position with Oxford University doing medical statistics, and I chatted to her about it and I was like, wow, I cannot even understand what your job is. You must be very bright, you're very clever, clearly important, but I have no idea what it is what you do. And as it turns out, she ended up being the lead statistician on the AstraZeneca vaccine. And they estimate that that vaccine, only in England, just in England, so not even the other UK nations, not even the rest of the world, has saved 60,000 lives. Now, this reminds me so much of Joseph's story in the Bible, who's sold into Slavery by his brothers. So if you ever think you're badly treated by your siblings, if you've not been sold into slavery, you're doing well compared to Joseph. And he went through a series of injustices. His life was incredibly hard, but eventually he ends up as the second most important person in Egypt. Prompted by God that there was a famine coming, he starts storing up wheat, and he ends up saving enormous numbers of lives in the region. And he says to his brothers when he's reconciling to them, what you meant was for evil, but God meant it for good, to save many lives. Now, the fact that their lives changed and it ended up saving tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of lives, doesn't make up for all the suffering that they went through. But for those of us who go through the danger, go through the storm, go through the valley, God will often give a purpose. Our experience yesterday was just amazing. Just amazing. It's a room full of people who are going through the hardest time imaginable. You know, people who haven't been through this, don't know what it's like, don't appreciate just how difficult it is, and that's fine because you've not been through it. But as a network called the Fertility Network, an organization that commissioned some research into the experience of infertility and just how traumatic it is. And so counselors have this chart of traumatic events, kind of ranking them as how difficult they are. So when they're dealing with people who are going through difficult events, they can look at this chart and kind of figure out how much trauma they've been through. And basically, right at the top of this chart is bereavement and cancer, kind of the two hardest things that you can go through. And so they commissioned this research to see, you know, where does infertility rack up on this scale, and they found that it sits between the top two, between bereavement and cancer, as one of the hardest things you can go through, because with the treatment you go through all kinds of trauma with your body, and then there's the emotional side of things where you go from the heights of hope and expectation to the depths of despair, often on a month by month basis, sometimes for years. It's an emotional roller coaster of constantly trying new treatments, new approaches, new diets, you name it. And as I said before, your life gets consumed by this. And so those who have been through it and have no certainty at all about their future are often deeply traumatized. But here's my memory of yesterday at this conference. Was a worship time where they sang a song that I'd not come across before. It's called Highlands. And I looked around the room, and these people who have been through hell, who've walked through hell, had their hands raised in the air. They were singing at the top of their voices, often with their eyes closed. You're the summit where my feet are, so I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadows, no less faithful when the night leads me astray. 'Cause you're the heaven where my heart is, in the highlands and the heartache all the same. Whatever I walk through, wherever I am, your name can move mountains. Wherever I stand and if ever I walk through the valley of death, I'll sing through the shadows my song of ascent. How perfect that these people who are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, through the worst moment in their lives, were singing a contemporary song of ascent. This song, this beautiful song, Psalm 124, is a song by people who've been through hell, and on the other side they go, you know what, I'm still standing, and the only reason I'm still standing is God. And the worship that the people sang in that room that day was so alive and so precious. I think what I'm discovering right now is that the valleys have become my mountaintops. You know, I used to love and still do enjoy, you know, if you go to a big event and they've got great sound production and fantastic musicians and there are thousands of other Christians with you and you're all singing along and it's just this wonderful kind of mountaintop experience, you know, whatever your mountaintop spiritual experience is, you know, that's mine. I used to think that was like the pinnacle. But as time has gone on, I've discovered that God is closer in the valleys, that there is gold in the valleys, that God has taught me so much more and met me much more deeply in those places. It's weird because they're still bad and they're still difficult and they still hurt like hell. But God just seems closer there. The Bible says that God is close to the brokenhearted. And I just wonder if God is closer to the brokenhearted perhaps than he is to anyone else. Because I've never known worship like that room full of broken people going through hell, worshipping their hearts out. So precious. This guy that we know from back in college was giving the final talk of the day. It's great to see him. It was really cool. But he told us he'd been praying all week about what to say. He felt a bit out of his depth. But one of the things that God gave him to say was that there is a song that only the brokenhearted can sing. Only those who have been through hell, been through the flood, been mauled by the tiger. Only those people who've come through the other side, they can sing a song that no one else can. I think Psalm 124 is one of those songs. I've been through the tsunami and somehow I am still here. I'm still standing. With a purpose I would have not had before. With a song on my lips I could never have sung before. I was reading a really helpful article this week from this woman who works at university and has noticed over time that her students have gone from being incredibly resilient and able to deal with all kinds of stuff to current day where people can't even manage to get essays in on time and have notes from doctors and phone calls from parents saying why they can't do things and become incredibly fragile. But rather than become judgmental of this emerging generation, she had a great deal of sympathy because they were a generation raised with the doom scroll. The reason that media organizations and our devices send us this bad news all the time is because our bodies are wired to pay distinct and close attention to anything that seems dangerous. It keeps us alive. But people have started to profit out of this because they know if they send sensational, dangerous messages through the ether to us, we will pay attention and they will get more money. They're incentivized to do it. And this generation has raised on it. So they have this sense that the world is going to doom. Climate catastrophe, political chaos, you name it. All the terrible things we're reminded of all the time. It feels inevitable that the ship is going down. And they feel responsible for it, and they also know they can do nothing about it. They're trapped in the snare. Destruction is inevitable. There is no way out. And to that generation, to all of us who feel that way, all of us who have been through and are going through hell, we can sing this song. Because it's Christ, it is Jesus that defines our lives. Not the doom scroll. If the Lord had not been on our side, come on, sing it with me. If the Lord had not been on our side. How about for you? If Jesus hadn't been in your life. Maybe Jesus isn't in your life. And it does feel doomed. There is nothing greater than following him. No one said it was going to be easier. In fact, it's probably going to get harder, but it will get so much better. There will be a new purpose in your life, a new song on your lips. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side, the flood would have engulfed us. The raging waters would have swept us away. But praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the foulest snare. The snare has been broken. We have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. If it had not been for the Lord, if he had not been on our side, maybe you never knew that God was on your side. Well, he is. He can liberate you from the snare, from the impending doom. You know what we have, me and my wife Lizzie, have in our, years of marriage been through hell and back. And not through our own skill, not through our own strength. We are still somehow standing because God was on our side, with a new song on our lips, testifying to everything he has done for us. I just want to end with the psalm again, because it's so good. I love it. I love it. This is my song. Like, when I hear this song, I'm like, this is the song of my people. This is the people who've been through what I've been through. These are the people who, at the end of the day, don't want to make clever arguments for God, don't want to have long debates about this stuff, but just want to testify to what has happened in their lives. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say. If the Lord had not been on our side, when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive. When their anger flared against us, the flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away. Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. We're not doomed. We're saved.